Welcome, everyone. I'm Lauren Hertel, Communications Manager for the Robert and Patricia Switzer Foundation and a 2003 Switzer Fellow. And welcome to this Switzer Foundation webinar series event, Water Footprint and Water Resource Reporting from Marcellus Shale Drilling and Hydraulic Fracturing in West Virginia and Pennsylvania. The Robert and Patricia Switzer Foundation drives positive environmental change by recognizing and fostering a diverse network of environmental leaders and mobilizing them through the Switzer Fellowship Network. Today's webinar features two of our fellows, 1996 fellow Evan Hansen and 2004 fellow Dr. Dustin Mulvaney. Evan Hansen is a principal in the water program with Downstream Strategies. Evan founded Downstream Strategies, which is an environmental consulting company in West Virginia, in 1997. He explores resource and environmental problems and solutions in three main areas: water, energy, and land. He manages interdisciplinary research teams with the company, performs quantitative and qualitative policy and scientific analyses, provides expert testimony, including on this subject, and facilitates stakeholder meetings and performs field monitoring. Dr. Dustin Mulvaney is an assistant professor of sustainable energy resources in the Department of Environmental Studies at San Jose State University. Dustin's an interdisciplinary researcher with expertise in social science research methodologies as well as life cycle analysis, with a focus on solar energy technologies, biofuels, and natural gas, which is, of course, relevant to our topic today. He's also a life cycle analysis consultant to biofuel companies and has provided expert testimony in numerous cases before the California Public Utilities Commission on the impacts of electricity prices on solar energy deployment and energy efficiency. Evan and Dustin have been collaborating with Earthworks to research the life cycle and regional impacts of hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, in the Marcellus Shale of the northeastern United States. Earthworks is a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting communities and the environment from the impacts of irresponsible mineral and energy development while seeking sustainable solutions at the same time. This webinar is a report on the findings of their collaboration. We are very happy to help support this important work with the Switzer Network Innovation Grant and to be hosting this webinar on the results today. The 530 fellows in the Switzer Fellowship Network represent diverse fields of interest, including science, law, policy, journalism, architecture, planning, among others. Through the Switzer Network Innovation Grants program, the Foundation seeks to tap this diverse network's collective potential for innovation and action to solve today's complex environmental issues. This grant program also intends to create a pathway towards environmental improvement that starts with sharing ideas that will lead to action and results. So, Dustin, if you wouldn't mind switching to the next slide, we'll just do a couple of quick housekeeping tips before we start in the webinar into your presentation. Super. So the slides and the recording of this entire webinar will be available on the Switzer website's blog. You see the link here. We'll also provide that at the end of the webinar today. It'll be available either later today or tomorrow, at the very latest by Friday, but we aim to have it up within 24 hours. All of your microphones are currently muted, so we will be opening up the floor for live audio questions at the end of Evan and Dustin's presentation. But for now, if you have questions, please use the chat window or the questions and answer panel so that we can address those questions as we go. Dustin and Evan will be taking short breaks during the presentation to answer follow-up questions. And like I said, after the presentation itself, you'll have a chance to use your phone or headset to ask live audio questions, and then we'll continue to keep the chat window and the questions panel open. If you have a question about a particular slide, if you would please make a note of the slide number so that we can make sure we address that particular slide, or you can also write down the slide title. Sometimes people have follow-up questions about specific slides, and that would really help us out to answer your question expeditiously. For those of you who are joining us from the media today, if you pose a question on the chat window or in the questions and answers panel, if you would please include your publication name or the affiliation who you work for at the beginning of your question, both so that we can track who's writing about what, but also so we can be sure that we can follow up with you after this presentation to provide you with any additional information on your questions. So with that, I would like to go ahead and turn the presentation now over to Dr. Dustin Mulvaney. Dustin, your mic is live.
Okay, thank you, Lauren, for that introduction. So we'll just start off with a couple of background slides about the big emergence of this new resource that we have, and that's the shale gas revolution. This data is from 2011, and it's showing you in the big brown swath there labeled shale gas, the really rapid growth of this particular resource base and its projections into the future. So one of the things that you note is that going out to 2040, we're looking at more than half, or maybe almost half of our natural gas coming from this particular shale resource. So it's going to be important into the future, and this has a lot of benefits for energy security, tax revenues, and job creation. So there are quite a number of benefits that are associated with the development of this resource, but also a number of considerations about the environment and other issues in the social world as well that we probably want to be thinking about early on. So that's one of the reasons we started on this particular project. In this next graphic, you can see the region of interest that we had for this project is in the Appalachian Basin up in the upper right-hand part of the United States, the northeast, stretching down into Tennessee. And I guess it's worth noting right now we're talking about the Marcellus Shale, and that's a shale basin that's in between two other shale basins. That's why there's that funny series of lines in that particular area. You could see the Devonian Shale is the shallowest shale basin, so that's outlined in red. The Marcellus Shale is outlined in blue, and that's the middle shale basin. And then the Utica Shale is much deeper, and that's outlined in purple. And it's worth noting here that the focus of this particular project occurs in a pretty water-rich area. So there is obviously droughts and things like that connote water stress and things like that. But there are other shale basins across the U.S. where there is a bit more concern about the availability of water year-round, not just during times of stress. So with that little bit of introduction, I want to turn it over now to Evan Hansen, who's going to give us a little more introduction, but also start talking about some of the data that we've put together for this.
This is Evan Hansen, and this slide shows a fairly typical Marcellus well pad. This one is located in north central West Virginia, and it shows a couple of key features. One is the pad itself, which is cut into the hill. It's very hilly around here, and a flat area is needed to assemble the equipment and to drill and frack the wells. But what I want to direct your attention to are the freshwater impoundment on the left-hand side and the waste pit on the right-hand side, because that's directly linked to the research that we did. In this presentation, we're going to try to be careful to use our words carefully. We're going to try to use water to mean actual fresh water, which in this case is stockpiled in the freshwater impoundment before it's used to fracture the well. And we'll distinguish that from fluid, which is the mixture of water, sand, and chemicals that's used to fracture the wells. That's the fracking fluid. And then there's a second type of fluid we'll be talking about, which is the flowback fluid that comes back to the surface after hydraulic fracturing. Next slide. Managing the water and the fluids at Marcellus pads is a logistical challenge because of the quantities involved. So you'll often see many trucks that are involved in getting the fresh water to the pads and removing the flowback fluid and the other waste from the pads. Next slide. This is a waste pit that's located in West Virginia, and you'll notice that there's no waste in it, and that's because it was recently pumped dry before this photo was taken, and the liner, that plastic liner, is actually being removed. The reason is that in this case, the flowback fluid that was stored there was draining through cracks in the liner directly into the bedrock that underlies this pit and contaminating the drinking water aquifer. This is a project that I was personally involved with over the last several years. Next slide. Groundwater monitoring data was collected before development of the site and during and after, and that data confirms that pollution levels did increase in the well as it increased in the drinking water well as the gas well was fracked and as the waste pit was used. So I think this is important background just to clarify how important it is that we're mindful about the water and fluid issues that are related to the development of the Marcellus play, because problems can and sometimes do occur. And I think that also further underscores the importance of proper data collection and reporting, which is really the focus of this report. It's really important to make sure that we have appropriate regulations and appropriate levels of enforcement in place. Next slide. This report focuses on West Virginia and Pennsylvania. And in recent years, both states have taken important steps to improve the regulation of Marcellus operations. In West Virginia, there are two key acts. There's the Horizontal Well Control Act from 2011, which was specifically passed in response to the rapid development of Marcellus Shale. But what might be overlooked is an act that was updated in 2008, the Water Resources Protection and Management Act. This was a law that was focused on large water users and required reporting of large volumes of water that are withdrawn from surface waters, and that's really come into play and underpins a lot of the data collection and reporting requirements here in West Virginia. In Pennsylvania, the Oil and Gas Act, otherwise known as Act 13, was passed in 2012, and together these laws and related regulations require a considerable amount of record keeping and reporting, and much of this data, as you'll see, is publicly accessible. Next slide. Our goal with this report was first to actually use those data sets to see what they're telling us in terms of how much water is being withdrawn, how much fluid is injected and waste recovered from these wells, and then to understand where that waste is being sent. And then once I turn it back over to Dustin, you'll learn more about how we normalized those fluid flows by energy production to calculate water footprints. So a key part of our research was to use the data sets, but as we were using them, we were assessing them at the same time. How complete are they? How accurate are they? And we provide some recommendations for improvement. Next slide. Many horizontal Marcellus gas wells have been permitted across these two states. In round numbers, we're up to roughly 2,000 in West Virginia and roughly 9,000 in Pennsylvania. And in this map, those permits that have been issued most recently are colored red, orange, and yellow. Much of the development is in northeast Pennsylvania, which happens to be within the Susquehanna River Basin, and that's important because of the way some of the data is collected and reported differently in that river basin. There's also quite a lot of activity in southwestern Pennsylvania and the northern panhandle of West Virginia. Next slide. Now I'd like to turn to some of the actual results from our report. We first looked at water withdrawals to understand where the water is coming from that's used to develop these Marcellus wells. And I would say, since this is the first slide that's a presentation of actual results, I wanted to say a word about the years of data that we're using. We're using recent data. In West Virginia, most of our data is from 2010 to 2012, and in Pennsylvania, depending on whether the data comes from the Pennsylvania DEP or the Susquehanna River Basin Commission, we're either using data from 2009 to 2011 or up to 2012. The Pennsylvania DEP data, while we were collecting that data, we became aware of a publication that came out that noted errors in that data and actually cleaned up that data. And we decided that instead of taking the time to clean up that database ourselves, it made more sense to use the data that was already cleaned. In any case, back to this slide, we're looking at the source of water withdrawals from Marcellus wells, and West Virginia and Pennsylvania show a fairly similar pattern. In West Virginia, we're lucky enough to have a breakdown into groundwater, surface water, purchased water, and reused flowback fluid. And by far, most of the water in West Virginia comes from surface water. It's that 81% plus some portion of the purchased water. That's water purchased, for example, from local water utilities. In Pennsylvania, we don't have that breakdown available. Now, the orange slices are important. In West Virginia, in these recent years, about 8% of withdrawals were actually not withdrawals of fresh water, but they were reused flowback fluid from other wells. The percentage in recent years in Pennsylvania was similar, but higher. It was 14%. So that's important because every gallon of water that comes from reuse rather than a freshwater withdrawal is protective of the environment. Keep those percentages in mind, though, because we'll be showing you something similar to compare those two in a few slides. Next slide. After the water is withdrawn and delivered to the well pad, the next step is to inject the fluid to perform the fracturing operation. According to the data that we looked at, again, this is the self-reporting data from operators, about 5 million gallons is being injected per well in West Virginia, and about 4.3 million gallons in Pennsylvania. Some of that fluid stays underground, and some comes back to the surface. And according to the self-reporting data, only about 8% of the fluid is recovered at the surface in West Virginia, and a similar percentage, but slightly less, 6% in Pennsylvania. The final column here is water that's removed from the hydrologic cycle, and that includes two components. It's the fluid that's injected but not recovered, but it's also the fluid that comes back to the surface and is disposed of in underground injection control wells. These underground injection control wells are specifically designed to dispose of polluted water deep underground where it should never interact with near-surface aquifers. So these figures are important, especially related to the water footprints that you'll hear about in a few minutes. Next slide. On the previous slide, you saw that in West Virginia, about 8% on average of injected fracturing fluid is recovered at the surface. This slide provides a little bit more detail. It shows the number of wells in our sample that report a certain percentage of recovery. And as you can see, by far most of the wells are reporting 10% or less recovery. Next slide. There are several different types of waste generated at Marcellus operations. The data shown here is for Pennsylvania, and there are three main types of waste shown. One is flowback fluid. That's the fluid that returns to the surface shortly after fracking. The second is brine at 47%, which is water that's very salty that originates in the shale itself and comes back to the surface after fracturing. And then the third is drilling waste. Now this is important for another reason too, which is that the reporting requirements are different between Pennsylvania and West Virginia. In Pennsylvania, all types of waste are reported, which is where this data came from. And not only are all types reported, but the reporting occurs every 6 months into the future. So there's a good full accounting of waste generated from Marcellus operations in Pennsylvania. It's different in West Virginia, though. In West Virginia, operators only report the flowback fluid, and they only report it once. For that reason, we have a rough estimate that only approximately this 38% that you see here of waste that's generated in West Virginia is actually reported. Next slide.
Evan, can I actually break in for just a minute? This is Lauren. Would you mind going back 2 slides? We had a question from Catherine Hilton about the reused water. So she's saying reused water is more highly concentrated with chemicals, and then asks how is that more protective of the environment. I missed that exact part of it, but and then it says in what way is any of the water recovered? She says it's clearly indicated in Pennsylvania that ONG waste treatment facilities do not have the capability, and then her question trailed off. But would you address that now for her, that clarifying question?
Sure. I'm not passing a judgment on the technology used for the recycling and reuse, nor exactly what the environmental implications of that are. I'm simply saying that every gallon of water, every gallon of fresh water that does not need to be pumped from an aquifer or does not need to be withdrawn from a stream, that in itself is protective of the environment. Now, clearly there are trade-offs involved.
Great, thank you. And for everyone else, if you have additional questions, please do feel free to post them to Q&A or chat while Evan and Dustin are presenting. Thanks.
Okay, once we had an accounting of the flowback fluid or the waste that returns to the surface, the question next arises, where does that waste go? In West Virginia, by far, most of the waste is being reused and recycled in recent years. According to this chart, 77%. About a quarter, or 22%, is being injected into underground injection control wells. The pattern is very different in recent years in Pennsylvania. Here, more than half of the waste is sent to treatment plants. These are either brine or industrial treatment plants or publicly owned treatment works. But either way, they discharge to surface waters. So that's a very different pattern in recent years in Pennsylvania. About a third of the Pennsylvania waste is being reused, and only about 6% in recent years was being sent to underground injection control wells. But it's important to note that this is one average percentage, and the patterns have been changing markedly in recent years. The next slide. For example, the solid orange line shows the percentage of Pennsylvania waste being sent to treatment plants that ultimately discharge to surface waters. And you can see that that's been decreasing very rapidly from 2009 through 2011. And due to some recent changes, we would expect that an analysis of the 2012 data would show that that decline is continuing. The two blue lines, one for Pennsylvania and one for reuse, interestingly seem to be converging at roughly 55 to 65% of the of the waste that's being reused and recycled. And the other interesting trend here is the consistent trend with the green lines between the two states, where the use of underground injection control wells is increasing year by year. Next slide. Finally, we did have a look at where the waste is being sent. And this map shows the horizontal Marcellus well permits as red dots, and then it shows the publicly owned treatment works and the UIC wells as triangles and squares. And those are the treatment works and the underground injection control wells that actually have taken waste in the last few years from West Virginia wells, and that actually had enough information with which to map them. And then next slide. When we crunch the numbers, we find that only a little bit more than half of the flowback fluid that's generated in West Virginia is actually staying in West Virginia. About 22% in recent years has been shipped to Pennsylvania. That's largely to reuse and other Marcellus operations. And about 21% has been shipped to Ohio, and that's largely to UIC wells. Next slide. We did a similar analysis in Pennsylvania and found, with the next slide, that the pattern is different here, that most of the Pennsylvania waste is staying in Pennsylvania, with about 9% in recent years being shipped to Ohio to UIC wells located there. So this would also be a good time to pause for questions before turning it back over to Dustin.
Great. Thank you, Evan. We actually have two in line. The first is from Monica Fryman, and if I'm mispronouncing your name, please accept my apologies. Her question is actually going back to, I think, 2 slides, maybe 3. She says, is the 77% of West Virginia water being reused? Is this for ag or road? And then there's a word I don't know. For roads or for fracking itself? What exactly, how is that water being reused?
That's for fracking itself.
It is for fracking itself. Okay, Monica, if that answers your question, great. If it doesn't, then please feel free to post a follow-up. And then we have a follow-up question from Susie Rankis. She says, is there any indication of whether water going to treatment plants is subjected to more cleaning or purification than typical wastewater? She says she guesses she's unclear if Pennsylvania has set up treatment specific to this industry.
In Pennsylvania, there's 2 categories of treatment plants that discharge to surface waters. There's publicly owned treatment works, which are basically wastewater treatment plants that are absolutely not designed to take this type of waste. And although some waste has been sent there to those types of plants, it's extremely little or possibly non-existent now. But the second type of treatment plant are the brine or industrial waste treatment plants, some of which are specifically designed for this type of waste. But even the use of those types of treatment plants, I believe, is declining over time due to potential impacts to surface waters.
Great, super. Those were the 2 questions we had so far. For everyone else, if you have a question, please do feel free to post it. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and continue on with Dustin's part of the presentation.
Okay, super. Thank you, Evan, for that first swath of data presentation there. I just also want to acknowledge that the first question that was talking about reusing water and the trade-offs between taking fresh water for injection and reusing some of the contaminated water. I think it is worth noting that it does create a second risk at the well site. If you're pumping down fresh water and pulling up dirty water, there's less risk, it seems, than there would be if you're pumping down dirty water and pumping up dirty water. So definitely an important question that we need to be thinking about going forward in some way. But there are, as Evan pointed out, there are definitely trade-offs. And preserving our freshwater resources is really what we ultimately need to do. And obviously both present challenges. So what I'm going to talk about for this next section here is what we did for trying to characterize the water use per unit energy, which was ultimately one of our starting objectives here. And we use a methodology developed by the Water Footprint Network called the Water Footprint Methodology, and this has received endorsement from the World Business Council on Sustainable Development and the United Nations Environmental Program. It's increasingly becoming popular for Fortune 500 companies to do kind of these water footprints and publish them as part of their sustainability reports. So we took this particular methodology, and in the water footprint method, they break things into a blue water footprint, which I'll talk about now, a gray water footprint, which I'll talk about later, and a green water footprint, which really only applies to agriculture, so I won't talk about the green water footprint. But in essence, the blue water footprint is trying to characterize how much water is actually being used. So in this particular case, we're talking about the volume of surface or groundwater that's consumed as a result of the production of natural gas in this case. And this is reported, so we had the water use data, and Evan already presented that, but we had to characterize or normalize this data based on energy production. And in these particular data sets, that was reported in MCF, which is a measure of natural gas production. So we had to we tried to understand, first of all, how much water is being used per well, and then how much gas is being used per well. And this actually was a bit challenging because you're using a lot of water up front, and then you're getting a lot of natural gas production over a long period of time. So we took a couple of guesses at, or not guesses, we looked to the literature for different approximations for how productive wells are over time. And we chose this particular estimate below because it was one of the ones that was actually published in the peer review literature. So one that's been verified in a journal. In that first year, and the study eventually that we are drawing from here was the master's thesis that eventually gets filled into this particular peer-reviewed journal, and the numbers are relatively the same, plus or minus, I think, 30,000 MCF. But basically, the trend line is that in the first year or two of production, you have a significant amount of gas production, and then that third year and fourth year, you see a significant decline. And the key here is that in the fourth year, you're only producing about 5% of what you're producing in that first year. Okay, so we took this model and we applied this to all the wells that we had natural gas production data for to try to come up with our own estimates for West Virginia. The number that we used for Pennsylvania was the peer-reviewed version of what you're seeing down here below. It's a paper by Lutz et al. in the Water Resources Journal, and it's relatively the same number as the one you see below. So the results from this was to look at 4 years of gas production, and it's widely believed that this first 4 years is where most of the natural gas production occurs. So we applied the initial amount of water being used and estimated natural gas production over that 4-year span. And the various water footprints that we came up for the different years reported in gallons per MCF, 2.2, 2.2, and 1.6 for the years that we looked at in West Virginia. And if you go down to Pennsylvania in bold, you could see those from 2009 to 2011 where we had the data 3.2, 3.8, and 4.2. Now what we did, we wanted to be sensitive to the fact that natural gas production could occur for longer periods of time. So we took that 5% of gas production that occurs in that fourth year and estimated that it would produce at that level for 2 more years without re-stimulation with additional water. And we checked to see essentially whether or not the numbers changed significantly. And then we actually modeled that out for 10 years, assuming that the water, just one use of water up front, 4 years of production, and then that fourth year production continues for another 6 years. So that's the 10 years of gas production number. The 30-year gas production number was a different peer-reviewed journal article that essentially tried to say that natural gas was being produced over 30 years. So we used that per well number to normalize our water data as well, although we're not completely comfortable with that number because of the fact that it assumes that there's no additional water being used to re-stimulate over that 30-year period, and pretty much every resource that we looked at, except for this article, said that there's definitely going to be water injections for re-stimulation. So if you take the numbers in bold in the 4 years of gas production for both Pennsylvania and West Virginia, you could see that the numbers are substantially higher than what prior research had done looking at water use per unit energy. And only one of our sensitivities using a number that we weren't necessarily comfortable using because of the assumption about water use. Only one of those sensitivities actually comes anywhere near any of these prior numbers. So we also looked at what's called the gray water footprint. Now, the gray water footprint is not an estimate of water use. It's just an indicator of the severity of water pollution. And the way it's expressed is in terms of freshwater volume required to assimilate or dilute an existing load of pollutants. So what we did for this was we came up with a dilution factor, which was the contaminant concentration, and we used two different sources that had estimated how much pollution there was in the flowback fluid that's returning to the surface. We divided that by various water quality thresholds. In most cases, these were EPA drinking water standards. We used that dilution factor in the gray water footprint, and that was the amount of water that was being disposed times this dilution factor, and then normalized or divided by the natural gas production. And those results are on this particular slide. So you can see we had data that showed kind of upper ranges, median ranges, and lower ranges for the contaminants found in the water. So you could see in the upper ranges, it's bromide that needs the most dilution. In the median ranges, it's barium that needs the most dilution, and sodium would be required to be diluted the most at the lower range. Now, we're not suggesting that this is actually being diluted, but we're just, again, trying to give you an indicator, a sense of the magnitude of water pollution for these. So you could see several orders of magnitude higher than the numbers that we reported from the blue water footprint in these cases. And it's worth noting that typically when you find flowback fluid, you're not going to have the lower end of contamination for every contaminant. So this lower range is more or less a sensitivity, assuming, let's say, that the flowback fluid did have the lower range for all of the contaminants present. Usually you're going to have a mixture of some contaminants being present in high levels and some being in low levels. So again, this is just an indicator of water severity, or the severity of water pollution, and really what it's saying is that the higher the gray water footprint, the more care you need the more care you need to manage these particular fluids on site and through transit, et cetera. So to wrap up, we got a couple of slides that cover the bases here, but essentially we're recognizing that the recent laws and rules are important steps forward, but our work here found that water and waste reporting can be improved in many ways, and we'll talk about that. The databases have errors, they're incomplete. The waste reporting varies considerably just across the two states we looked at. There's full reporting over the life of the well for Pennsylvania, whereas in West Virginia you just have this short period of reporting. And the gas production reporting varies as well, which was challenging for our estimates of our efforts to try to normalize the water and the water use by energy. So in Pennsylvania, they're reporting in 6-month chunks, whereas it's monthly reporting in West Virginia. Water withdrawals. Over 80% of surface water, we're coming from, in West Virginia, over 80% of the surface water was being used for the withdrawals. In injection, 5 million gallons per well were being used in West Virginia. 4.3 million gallons per well were being used in Pennsylvania, and that's pretty similar to other numbers that we had seen previously, so I think those shouldn't shock anybody. In terms of recovery, these numbers were also close to what was being reported before, but a little bit lower, actually. 8% of injected fluid is being recovered in West Virginia, and only 6% the ejected fluid is recovered in Pennsylvania. And it's worth noting that this water is being injected well below the aquifer. So that means it is actually being permanently removed from the hydrologic cycle. So it is no longer available for ecosystem services or for drinking water, etc. Reuse. A significant amount of waste is now reused, and as the question suggested, this poses maybe some contradictions a little bit. Substitutes for a small amount of water withdrawals, so it is displacing some freshwater withdrawals, which, as Evan suggested, is a good thing. Limitations, but there are limitations to how much recycled water can be used. Right? There's only so much is coming back up, and the industry is growing so fast. You're not going to be able to frack every well with recycled water. So reuse can't be the single solution to protect the state's water resources in the end here. Now, a couple points on this question of water removed from the hydrologic cycle. The water remains underground at the gas well, or is injected at an underground injection control well. So, again, it is actually being removed from the hydrologic cycle. In water-rich states, the timing and location is important, partly because there are times of year, certain seasons where you have drought occurring, etc. And it also might be instructive for water-poor states with shale plays, because they're always under water stress. And then just to kind of remind everybody that on the data that I just presented, which is that the blue water footprints are in fact higher than previously believed. So we are using more water per well than the research had shown to date on this. In terms of waste generation, just to go back to the numbers that Evan presented, West Virginia, we're talking about 125 million gallons in 2010, 114 million gallons in 2011. In Pennsylvania, 363 million gallons in 2010, 613 million gallons in 2011, which was a 70% increase. So waste handling will continue to be a crucial question until the pace of development slows. Okay, so we have a couple of recommendations here. One is to report withdrawals by individual well. What we found was that water withdrawals were being reported, but they were being reported to the well site. So we can never figure out which well the water went into when you had a site with 4 or 5 wells. And that was challenging for coming up with these per well estimates that we had. Making data entry less error-prone seems to be an important objective as well. We found lots of errors in the data sets. And then making all data sets searchable online seems to be something that we should be moving toward here if we want to have better disclosure on this. In West Virginia, specifically trying to compel operators to report data. And also we're suggesting unifying the two WVDEP units that are related to oil and gas. So we think that some of the mistakes that are being made are falling through the cracks between two different units that are managing sort of the same data sets. And in Pennsylvania, making shale-specific withdrawal data fully and freely available across the entire state seems to be an important recommendation we're making. And making the completion reports, which can contain a lot of important information, available electronically seems to be really important. Again, these are not available electronically at this point. So a couple final thoughts. Just volumes of water and waste are substantial. I think that becomes clear just looking at the numbers. But the true volumes are still not known, partly because of the data gaps that we were talking about. Improvements in reporting, data sharing, and enforcement are still needed. So the challenge of handling a growing volume of waste to avoid environmental harm will continue into the future, particularly as we start thinking about the deeper Utica Shale, which the deeper the well, the more water you're likely to use to get that resource out. So before we go to questions, I wanted to thank, first of all, our external reviewers who gave us a really, really detailed look at our report here, including the co-founder of the water footprint methodology and a couple of researchers who had actually looked at the data that we looked at as well, so that we were looking at the same things and weren't making false interpretations, as well as a few people who understand the Marcellus Shale geology and hydrology, so that we didn't have any miscommunication there. We want to thank our data sources. Dr. Brian Lutz helped us with his data set. SkyTruth, the WVDEP water use section, and the SRBC, the Susquehanna River Basin Commission, also were helpful in providing us with data. And I want to remind everybody that we have a third co-author on this, and that's Megan Betcher. And I also wanted to point out and thank Brian Rosa, who helped us analyze the data. So with that, thank you for your attention, and we're happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Dustin. We have quite a few in the queue, so we have quite a few questions to answer. The first question I'd like to pose actually came from Mike Lee. He said there have been other estimates that show as much as a third of the water used to frack wells returns as flowback water. How do you account for the variance between those estimates and the figures today?
I can try that, Evan. So it depends on the shale basin. The shale basins are going to differ, and in many cases there's what's called formation water down below the surface. And in other cases, it's just that the geology itself holds more of the water. So I think the numbers that it sounds like you're talking about are something maybe from the Barnett Shale, where I think that's the case, where there's a lot of formation water and the geology is such that they can actually draw the water back up. Evan, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? Does that sound like a fair characterization?
I think that's fair. And in our report, we do review some of the previous estimates and place our estimate in that context. But I think it's just important also when you look at those percentages to see exactly what type of fluids are being reported, just to make sure that they're comparable to what we're reporting, which is the flowback fluid.
Just so you both know, Mike actually posted a follow-up. He says that actually the one-third estimate he saw was in the Marcellus. So, but he just to kind of.
I know that was from an author named Arthur, I think, and that was in 2008. And all the other numbers that we see are much, much lower, including ones from industry and from Penn State Extension, who does a lot of work on this. So I think that number was an early estimate, and it wasn't based on actual data.
Okay, super. I just wanted to say before I run through the rest of these questions, some of these date back, several minutes in the webinar, 10, 15 minutes. So for those of you who are still posing questions, please don't get frustrated. We are getting to your questions. I've got all of them in the queue ready to go. So just bear with us here. The one that came up first right after your last break was from Glynis Board. She's actually referring back to slides 19 and 17. And her question was, does that waste being shipped wherever include all waste, or is it just plowback? It was just a clarifying one on some slides, so I wanted to make sure we got that in.
Our data for West Virginia is flowback only because that's what was reported, but our data for Pennsylvania includes all waste types.
Okay, super. This next question is from Jane Birdsong. She says, since 4.7 million gallons out of every 5 million taken by each well for drilling is removed from the hydrologic cycle, what does that do to our potential precipitation?
I could take a crack at that. 4.7 million gallons is a large number. It seems like a large number, but I think in terms of the Earth's hydrologic cycle, it's actually quite small. So I have not seen any scientific study of that, but my first impression, at least in water-rich areas like West Virginia and Pennsylvania, is that the hydrologic cycle is actually quite large.
Okay. The next question was from Heather. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add, it doesn't, I think Evan hits it right on the head there, but I think also it's just worth noting that really the impacts are when even in water-rich areas, when the droughts are happening and things like that, when a little marginal water might make a difference for a stream being dewatered or something like that. But sorry, go ahead, Lauren, I'm sorry.
Okay, no, it's great. The next question came from Heather Cooley. She asked, how is it that so little of the flowback is recovered, yet flowback accounts for such a large percentage of water use for fracking?
Well, I think the way the numbers work out is that there's a large percentage of the flowback that's reused and recycled, but that represents a small amount of the total withdrawals that are needed to continue developing the Marcellus play. So I think that's just, I'm not sure if this is a satisfactory answer, but it's just the way that the numbers work out in terms of the volumes that are recovered versus the volumes needed to be injected.
Okay. The next question was from Bill Nyman. Sorry, I'm just scrolling back to his question here. He says, how common is it for reused water to come from off-site?
Well, I could take a crack at that. The databases do include information about the destination of each shipment of waste, at least where the databases are filled out completely. So there is information that shows API numbers, basically, for wells that accept reused flowback fluid. And we might want to turn to Megan to give a final answer on this, but my understanding is that it's common for fluid that's recovered in one well to be reused at another well.
Megan, I've gone ahead and unmuted Megan, so Megan, if you'd like to tackle that and introduce yourself as well, since this is the first time we're hearing from you.
Okay, my name is Megan Betcher, and I work with Downstream Strategies with Evan. And I think to answer that question, I think Evan actually did a pretty good job. We do have that data for West Virginia, but for various reasons it's difficult to trace that water from one well to the next. So we didn't tackle that challenge yet, but I think that it is pretty common for water to be reused off-site.
Okay, super. We have a bunch of questions coming in, so if you guys don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next one. Megan, I'll go ahead and mute you again, but I can unmute you if we have some follow-up. The next question is from Marina, and I hope I pronounced this correctly, Yodice? Yodice? I don't know. She asks, when we talk about reporting, do we refer to voluntary reporting from the companies operating the wells or rather public data?
This is self-reported data from the operators, but it's data that they are required to report. It's similar but slightly different in both states, but basically the data is reported to the Department of Environmental Protection in each state, which then compiles the data into databases that for the most part, but not entirely, are publicly available and searchable.
Okay. So the next question, I'm just going to have to scroll back up here. Bear with me for just a minute. This is from Bahari Sene. She says, I have a question regarding the waste which is shipped to Ohio or West Virginia. What's the reason behind their shipment, and what would happen to those in other states?
The waste that's shipped to Ohio is largely sent there to make use of the underground injection control wells that are so prevalent in Ohio. So each company or operator needs to make a determination of what's most cost effective in terms of disposing or reusing the waste. And in many cases, it just so happens that they make a determination that it's best to ship it to Ohio.
Mm-hmm. So, and Sarah Souther at UW-Madison actually had a follow-up question about the data reporting one. she was asking, she said, is data reporting mandatory for the data used to generate the figures, which is sort of a follow-up to Marina's question. And more importantly, how much confidence do you have that the companies are accurately reporting generated waste and wastewater? Do you think underreporting is an issue? Which I believe, Dustin, you covered a little bit at the end, but maybe you could speak more about that.
Yeah, I don't know if, Evan, I'll let you go. I actually don't have much knowledge on whether or not to trust the reporting mechanism. Errors happen all the time with all data entry, so there's that aspect of things. But I don't think we have enough information to make a call on whether or not we think things are being accurately reported. It would be interesting to interview a lot of people who work at these sites about kind of their everyday practices for reporting to see if we can reach some conclusions. But I'm sure Evan has thought a little bit more about this than I have, so I'm going to ask him to maybe speak to that.
Yeah, Dustin, if you would, I would go to slide 41.
Yeah.
We did have enough information, as you'll see in this slide, for the West Virginia database to make an estimate of whether the data set is complete. And while the reporting is required to occur within a one-year time period, there does not seem to be any effective system in place to make sure that this occurs. And that's why one of our recommendations was to compel operators in West Virginia to report. Our best estimate, and these are admittedly rough numbers, but I think they give you a good order of magnitude, is that for the wells that had injections in 2010 and 2011, only about 35% of those had reported their water data, even though there's supposed to be only a one-year time horizon within which to report that data. So this suggests to us that, at least in West Virginia, the database is incomplete, and steps do need to be taken to compel operators to report. In terms of the accuracy, if you can go back to the previous slide, we did some quality control steps where we removed data where we believed that there were mistakes. And again, this is focusing in on the West Virginia data because that's where we performed the quality control ourselves, as opposed to using a data set that had already been cleaned. But we found that roughly 1/3 of the data we found to be suspect, and we decided to eliminate it before we crunched our numbers because we wanted to make sure that the data we used for our analysis was self-consistent and reliable. So these two slides illustrate how we think that, at least in West Virginia, while we appreciate that there's a whole lot more data now being collected and reported, there's still some important steps to take.
And this is Lauren again. I just wanted to say we are aware that we're at time right now for the webinar. We have several pending questions. I think, Dustin and Evan, you're available, right, to stay on for a few more minutes and get to the end of the questions?
Sure.
Okay. And for those of you who need to log off, we'll make sure that any questions that for whatever reason don't get answered by the end, by the time our presenters have to go, we'll make sure that we put those on our website, on the blog, with the post of this webinar, and I'll repost that link to the chat in just a moment so that you all can find that. You'll also, everyone who attended the webinar today will receive a link by email giving you the URL as well, where the video from the webinar recording will be posted by tomorrow afternoon, and we'll answer additional questions there, and you'll also have a chance to comment at that point on the webinar itself and pose any follow-up questions that you think of later. So the next question was from Bob Donnan. He says, with so many large wastewater spills resulting from overland temporary pipelines between well sites and impoundments, has any additional regulation or improvement been considered?
I don't have a good answer to that because we were focusing on our research on the data collection and reporting.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't
Fair
have
enough.
a good answer to that either. Yeah.
The next question is again from Mike Lee. He's saying the number for the amount of water recovered from gas wells is lower than previous estimates. Could you address that? Oh, excuse me, that was his old question. I beg your pardon. He rephrased it later then. Sorry about that. Let me move down to David Heyman, who's the next question. He says, are there any studies on the impact of the freshwater withdrawal from freshwater systems, such as reduced water flow in rivers, drier environments, etc.? This seems to be a major gap in studies of fracking.
I have not seen any, but I've seen several mentions of this being a pressing need in ecology journals, for example. So I'm not familiar with any particular studies in the peer-reviewed literature, but in peer-reviewed publications, people have mentioned this as kind of a pressing need on the horizon to get people to look at these particular questions. Maybe Evan has seen something.
No, I think I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Mike did have a follow-up question. I've got it now. He says, you mentioned that this research was done in a water-rich area. Could you estimate the impact that shale drilling would have in drought-prone areas like Texas, Colorado, and North Dakota? Is it safe to say we need to do research in those areas?
Well, one way to think about is the figures that we calculated for water removed from the hydrologic cycle, where that's actual water that is now flowing down rivers or in our shallow aquifers, which would then be removed from the hydrologic cycle. So that's sort of a first cut approximation of what type of impacts would occur with the same water patterns in a water poor area.
Yeah, and there just hasn't been the work done. I think the work that's been done in these water poor areas are estimates of how much water is being used, but what are the impacts? That hasn't been addressed yet.
Okay. Lisa Biddle actually has a question about the water recovery rate. She says, when you say 8% of water is recovered, do you mean over the life of the well or during the initial flowback period? And if it's the flowback period, how do you define that period?
In West Virginia, there's a specific definition, which is the period of time, which is 30 days or half of the water injected. So that's specifically what we're talking about with the 8% in West Virginia.
Okay. Sue Chang had a question. She says, with the increased trend of using UIC wells, has there been any evidence of an increased seismic activity? And I should mention Sue is one of our fellows in California.
Well, there definitely have been reports of seismic activity that have been linked to these underground injection control wells. And I think that's an important point to raise. I think when these issues get raised in the media, sometimes people jump to the conclusion that the seismic activities are related to the fracking itself. But in reality, it's related to these underground injection control wells that are disposing of the waste from fracking operations. But these have been documented in the Marcellus region, in Ohio, and in West Virginia, and have been identified as such by state agencies.
Yeah, I think actually the USGS, who follows all the tectonic activity in the United States, and I guess I follow it everywhere, has also documented it, but also outside of Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, where there's a big well where a lot of water is being disposed from the Barnett Shale.
Okay. Sabrina Hardenberg had a question. She says, given the large amount of water to process, how are municipalities dealing with the additional cost? And are there some figures for this to compare?
I do not have information to specifically answer that question.
Yeah, I don't either. I don't think anybody, again, has looked at that particular question. I think what we're realizing is there's a lot of unanswered questions here, and there's a lot of research to be done on this particular topic because there's a lot of kind of important stuff happening here. So.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of different fields involved as well, fields that don't necessarily work together on a regular basis.
Correct, yep.
So another question from Mike. Mike's got great questions here. He says, The gas industry says it stopped sending drilling wastewater to treatment plants that discharge into rivers and streams in Pennsylvania in 2011, and asks if you can address that issue, talking about sort of where the gas industry is sending that wastewater in Pennsylvania.
Evan, you want to take that?
Sure.
I can try to, too.
Well, we did show that chart near the beginning that showed the percent of the waste that's being sent to treatment plants. And in Pennsylvania, the data that we analyzed, it's the one after this, slide 17, showed the orange line. Yeah, go forward to slide 17. Right, there's the orange line that shows the percentage of waste in Pennsylvania being sent to treatment plants, and it declined significantly. And I do believe that if we looked at the 2012 data, we would see that line declines significantly further still, because the Pennsylvania DEP has taken steps to try to limit the use of treatment plants that discharge the surface waters. Did you want to add that, Dustin?
Well, I was just going to add that one was that the measure was a voluntary one, if I'm understanding the question correctly, if we're talking about the same thing. And that I thought I saw a news story recently about a lawsuit against someone who's not doing that, not following the new directive that was put out.
Okay. There was another question here from Catherine Hilton. It goes back to slide 23, and she's got some big chemical names in here, so I'll try my best. She's asking, were xylenes, benzenes, dichloroethene, et cetera, modeled using your formula? Waste now in Pennsylvania is being sent to municipal landfills, and so she wanted to ask a little bit about that.
Yeah, so let me try to figure out which is the best to talk about this. So these are all the chemicals that we screened for our dilution factor for the gray water footprint. And what were the chemicals again? TCE, I heard was one of them.
I did my best. Xylenes, benzenes, dichloroethene, ethylene.
Yeah, so the BTEX, if you see down there on the contaminant list, in between manganese and strontium, that included benzene and toluene. But the other chemicals did not were not present in the samples that were evaluated that we looked at and used as our estimates for the amount of contaminants in the flowback fluid.
Okay. I think we just have one last question here. It's a follow-up from Susie Rankus. She was saying there was a question about moving 4.7 million gallons and the hydrologic cycle. And she wants to repose the questions about, given the number of times that wells are drilled into, plus all the future development over potentially the next 20 years. When you look at it in that perspective, her follow-up is, does that sort of have a bigger impact on hydrologic cycles in the area?
Well, I do think that that's an important question, and I hate to punt on the last question here, but I do think the cumulative impacts of development deserve careful attention, because one well, while the numbers seem large, are not large on the scale of a large watershed or a river basin. So I do think that a hydrologist would be the appropriate person to study that question on the true impacts of the hydrologic cycle from the cumulative withdrawal of water from the hydrologic cycle.
And actually, it's not quite the last question, because there was one from Glynis Board, and I think it's a good one. She says, did anyone mention or talk about where all of this water is being pulled from? And I would just sort of add to that what the impacts might be of where the water is coming from in these areas, if you could address that.
The best data we have on that is in West Virginia. For one thing, we have the breakdown between surface water and groundwater, but there is information that's now being collected about specifically where it's coming from. I believe that when the well permits are granted in the water management plan, that they need to provide information about where they plan to withdraw the water, and then after it's actually withdrawn, they need to report where it actually came from. That being said, we didn't analyze that data, so we can't tell you exactly where it's coming from. But from observation, it is coming from a combination of small headwater streams and everything from there to larger rivers. The West Virginia DEP has implemented a system where operators can go online, which will give them an indication of where it's okay to withdraw water from and where it's not okay based on stream flows, essentially. So this is guidance that's really important to help the industry steer clear of small streams and times when there's simply not enough water to withdraw.
Super. And I actually just have one last question I'd like to pose for both of you. Given that your report is out now, you've testified, for you and your companies, and Dustin, in your case, your research agenda, what will you be doing next? Do you have some sense of which questions are most interesting and relevant for your work and where you'd like to go next now that you've finished this particular grant and this particular collaboration?
I could take a shot. We had a couple little side projects along that we were collaborating on with this as well, involving moving around wastewater and land use change that we'll continue to talk about, and I hope we can continue to collaborate on stuff. As far as coming and doing something in my backyard here in California, coming over to California, the Monterey Shale is suggested by some to be the largest oil basin in North America. So I've become increasingly interested in environmental justice questions in areas of the Central Valley where they're going to be doing a lot of the fracking, and there's already issues with water resource vulnerability and vulnerability to air pollution. So that's something that I'm hoping to start over the next few months, and building, hopefully, again, I think it was really helpful in this particular case to have an interdisciplinary team with people who think about projects in different ways and can bring different skills and hopefully transform the way we think about these problems. So that's what I'm hoping to do next. So, Evan, go for it.
I would add to that the industry is evolving over time, and the data collection and reporting hopefully is going to be improving over time. So one thing that would be interesting would simply be to do the same type of analysis 1 year later and see how things have changed.
That would be great. Well, that's all we have from our side. I want to thank you on behalf of Switzer, the Switzer Foundation, for not only presenting this webinar, but also finding a way to work collaboratively, making use of the Switzer Network Innovation Grant program, and for taking your time today to answer so many of the questions that our audience had. Thank you very, very much for your time, and thank you to everyone who participated in the program today. We will have a recording of it available at switzernetwork.org/blog. That will be up within 24 hours. So thanks to everyone.